The fire was gone, but the smoke still carried everything people had lost. Northern California looked like a place that had forgotten its own color. The sky was gray, not from clouds, but from leftover smoke that refused. Entire neighborhoods had turned into quiet rows of blackened wood, twisted metal. The air smelled like burned memories. Sirens had stopped, but the silence felt louder than the fire ever did. Avery Collins moved quickly across what used to be her front yard, her sneakers pressed into ash that once covered green grass. Her hands were shaking as she packed the trunk of her car. Important documents were stacked in a folder: birth certificate, insurance paper, bank statements. A small suitcase sat beside them. She grabbed a framed photo from the kitchen counter, wiping soot off the glass with the. Her face was streaked with smoke and tears she refused to acknowledge. She did not allow herself to look at what remained of her home for too long. If she looked too carefully, she might stop moving. And she could not stop moving. Across the street stood Landon Pierce, holding a flashlight even though the sun had already risen. His rental house had barely survived. The roof was damaged. The backyard fence was gone. But the walls were still standing. He felt both grateful and guilty at the same time. Beside him stood his 7-year-old triplets, Isla, Beckham, and Noel. They wore oversized masks to block the smoke, their small hands clutching each other as they watched the neighborhood burn. Landon had moved here 3 years earlier after losing his wife to illness. He had wanted a fresh start, a quiet town, safer air, slower days. Now even that felt uncertain. "Is our house going to fall down?" Noel asked softly. "No," Landon said steadily, kneeling to meet her eyes. "We rebuild what needs fixing." He said it calmly, even though inside he felt the familiar pressure of being the only adult holding everything together. Single parenthood had taught him to stay strong and visible. Cry later. Fix now. Isla's attention shifted back to Avery across the street. "She's alone." Beckham nodded. "She's not asking anyone for help." They watched Avery move faster, almost desperately. She opened the back seat and placed the framed photo carefully inside. It was the only thing she held gently. Everything else was rushed. She checked her phone quickly, then looked at the sky again, as if expecting flames to. Landon recognized. It was the look of someone who has lost too much in one night and is afraid of losing. Avery shut the trunk hard. The sound echoed down the empty street. She took one last glance at the remains of her house but did not walk close. Instead, she moved toward the driver's seat, her breath uneven. In her hurry, something slipped from the passenger side onto the driveway. It landed softly in the ash. The triplets saw it immediately. Isla tilted her head. She dropped something. Beckham squinted. "It's not trash." Noelle stepped forward slightly, her small boots. "It looks important." Landon was still watching Avery's face, not the ground. He saw exhaustion, shock, and a quiet kind of disbelief. He had seen that same expression in the mirror years ago after hospital visits changed his life forever. The car engine started. Avery gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against. She did not look back again. She believed she had taken what mattered. She drove away slowly, tires crunching over broken gravel and ash. The triplets remained frozen for a moment. Then Beckham walked closer to the driveway. The object lay half covered in gray dust. It was a small wooden box, the kind that holds letters or keys. One corner was slightly burned, but the lid remained intact. It did not look like something random. It looked like something chosen. Isla bent down carefully and brushed ash away. The top of the box revealed faint carved initials. "She didn't mean to leave," Isla said quietly. Noelle looked toward the road where Avery's car had disappeared. "She's going to come back." Landon finally noticed what they were staring at. He stepped closer, picking up the box gently. It was heavier than it looked. She must have been. He understood that kind of overwhelm. When the fire alarms ring in your life, you grab documents and clothes. Sometimes you forget the things that hold your heart. Beckham looked at his father seriously. "That's not just stuff." Landon nodded slowly. He felt it too. The weight was not from wood, it was from memory. Smoke drifted lightly through the air again as distant helicopters passed overhead. The neighborhood looked like a place between endings, and people were scattered, loading cars, speaking to insurance agents, trying to act brave for children watching from porches. Landon held the box, carefully, his children standing close around him. Across the empty road, Avery's driveway looked incomplete without it. Isla's voice dropped to a whisper. "She thinks she saved everything," Noelle added softly. "But she didn't." Landon stared at the wooden box in his hand and felt a quiet understanding. This was not just an object left behind in panic. It was something she would notice missing the moment the shock faded. And when she did, she would have to come back to the ashes she tried not to. What Avery left behind was not just a wooden box, it was the one piece of her past she would. Some men are forced to become strong. He chose to become present. Years before wildfire smoke filled the sky, Landon Pierce stood in a hospital hallway that's dark. A police officer had just finished speaking, but the words kept repeating in his head. Car accident. Instant. No suffering. His wife, Marissa, was gone before he'd say goodbye. One moment he was a husband planning dinner. The next, he was a single father of 3 5-year-olds who did not understand why their mother would never walk through the front door again. He remembered kneeling in the living room trying to explain something he did not understand himself. Isla cried first. Beckham stared at the floor in silence. Noelle asked if Mommy would wake up tomorrow. Landon had never felt so unprepared in his life. Family came quickly at first. His sister stayed for 2 weeks. His parents visited on weekends. Friends dropped off meals and offered help. But grief is heavy, and not everyone knows how long to carry it. Slowly, visits became shorter. Calls came less often. People returned to their own lives. Landon did not blame them. Still, the quiet felt louder each month. He worked in IT before the accident, traveling often and chasing promotions that promised bigger salaries. After Marissa died, he turned down 2 major career opportunities. Instead, he took remote contracts that paid less but allowed him to sit at the kitchen table while his children did homework. He answered emails during nap times. He coded late at night after bedtime stories were finished. He chose presence over prestige. Some nights he fell asleep on the couch with his laptop still. Some mornings he woke up already tired, but he never missed school. He never skipped parent-teacher meetings. He stayed when it would have been easier to bury himself in work. The children noticed. Isla learned to study his face carefully. If his jaw tightened, she would quietly bring him a glass of water. Beckham began helping with small chores without being asked. Noelle developed a soft way of placing her hand on his shoulder when she sensed he felt overwhelmed. They grew up reading emotional weather the way other children. When Landon decided to move them to Northern California, 3 years later, it was for a fresh start. The town felt peaceful. The air felt clean. The rental house was small but warm. For the first time in years, he felt like stability was possible. Then the wildfire. Flames did not reach their home fully, but smoke filled every room. Ash covered the yard. The fence burned. For a few terrifying hours, he had packed their belongings into the car, ready to evacuate with no promise of return. Watching fire move across hills reminded him too much of how quickly life can disappear. He was tired of rebuilding. Standing in the smoky street now, holding the wooden box Avery had left behind, he felt that old exhaustion press into his chest. He wanted to focus only on his recovery. Fix the fence. Clean the air filters. Call the insurance company. Keep moving forward. But his children, looking at fences or paperwork. She was shaking, Isla said softly, remembering Avery's hand. Beckham nodded, not just scared, like she lost something before this. Noelle stared at the road where Avery's car had vanished. She didn't look back at her house. Landon exhaled slowly. They were right. Avery's panic had felt deeper than property law. It felt like someone who had already known heartbreak before the fire. He looked down at the wooden box again. Ash clung to the edges. The carved initials were partially blackened, but still clear. Dad, Beckham said gently, we can't just keep. I know, Landon replied, but returning it meant stepping into someone else's pain. It meant knocking on the door of a woman whose house had just burned down and saying, you forgot something important. It meant opening space for connection when he barely had energy for it. He remembered the first months after Marissa, the nights he wished someone would knock on his door, not with sympathy, but with simple presence. Someone who would say, I see how hard this is. The wildfire had shaken the stability he fought so hard to build. He did not want more complications. He wanted quiet repair. Still, the triplets were already moving. Isla brushed the ash more carefully from the box. Beckham examined the small latch to make sure it was intact. Noelle held it gently, almost respectfully. They were not treating it like an object. They were treating it like something alive. Landon watched them and felt the familiar tug between self-protection and compassion. Staying for his own family had cost him promotions, sleep. Staying for someone else might cost more, but he had taught his children that presence matters, and now they were reflecting that lesson back to him. He crouched beside them. We'll return it, but carefully. Isla smiled noddingly. Beckham nodded. Noelle hugged the box closer to her chest. As Landon stood up, he felt something shift inside him. This was not just about returning a forgotten item. It was about stepping towards someone else's loneliness. He looked once more at the carved initials, because when he finally opened the box just enough to confirm it was safe inside, what he saw made his chest tighten. When Landon saw what the children were holding inside that wooden box, he realized returning it might pull them into something far bigger than they expected. Some things survive fire, because they were never meant to burn. When Landon carefully lifted the lid of the wooden box, just enough to see inside, he felt his breath catch. The box was fireproof, lined with a thin metal interior that had protected its contents from. Inside were neatly folded children's drawings, edges slightly curled but untouched by flame. There were medical papers clipped together with careful order, and beneath them, resting flat and protected in a clear sleeve, was a worn adoption certificate. The name printed across the top read, Avery Collins, adoptive parent. Landon closed the lid slowly, his chest tightening in quiet understanding. Isla whispered, voice soft but certain. Beckham nodded, staring at the corner of a crayon drawing visible through the open lid. It showed a small house with 3 stick figures holding. Those are important, he said simply. Noelle traced her finger gently over the carved initial. She didn't leave this on purpose. Landon knew that already. No one packs medical papers and legal documents into a fireproof box, unless they understand how fragile life can be. Avery had likely placed that box somewhere safe during evacuation, intending to grab it last. In the panic of smoke and urgency, she saved the visible essentials and left behind the invisible, the proof of belonging, the proof of family. The wildfire had destroyed her house. This box carried the only piece that confirmed her children were hers. She's an adoptive mom, Isla said. That means she chose her kids. Becoming a single parent overnight had not been his decision, but staying every day afterward had been. He stood up slowly, holding the box more carefully now. Dad, we have to give it back, Beckham said, not demanding, just stating what felt obvious. Landon hesitated. People need space during crisis, he replied quietly. She might not want strangers showing up. But even as he said it, he remembered the months after Marissa died. The isolation, the quiet house, the way people assumed he needed distance when needed was someone willing. Noelle stepped closer and gently pressed her hand against his arm. She looked alone. Isla had already pulled out her phone. We can look up evacuation centers, she said calmly. They're posting lists of temporary housing online. Landon almost smiled, despite the heaviness. His children did not argue loudly. They moved toward solutions quietly. Within minutes, Beckham found a community update page listing residents relocated to temporary shelters. Isla scanned the names carefully. There it was, Avery Collins, assigned to Redwood Community Evacuation Center. She's there, Isla said softly. Landon felt the familiar tension between self-protection and compassion tighten inside him again. Driving to the center meant stepping further into her life. It meant not just returning an object, but possibly witnessing more pain than he felt ready for. He looked at his children, standing close together, their faces serious but hopeful. They had grown up reading. Adult pain the way others read books. They sensed something deeper in Avery's panic than loss of property. She wasn't just scared of the fire, Beckham added. She was scared of losing something else. He understood that fear too well. He grabbed his car keys. The drive to Redwood Community Center was quiet. Smoke still lingered in the air, but the sky had begun to clear slightly. Emergency vehicles lined the streets. Volunteers handed out water bottles and blankets outside the center's entrance. Landon parked and turned off the engine. For a moment he sat still. This isn't our responsibility, almost to himself, but it feels like. The words were simple, but they cut through his head. He stepped out of the car, the wooden box tucked securely. The triplets walked beside him, steady and silent. Inside the evacuation center, rows of folding cots filled the. Families sat in small groups. Some stared blankly ahead. Others spoke in low voices. The air carried exhaustion more. Landon approached a volunteer at the registration desk. We're looking for Avery Collins, he said politely. We believe she may have left something important behind. The volunteer scanned a list and pointed toward the far corner of the. Landon's steps slowed as he moved closer. Avery sat on a cot near the wall, her posture curved inward. But she was not alone. Beside her sat 2 young children, a boy around 8 and a little girl no older than 5. The boy held her hand tightly. The girl clutched a stuffed animal covered in soot. Landon felt his chest tighten again. The fire had not only threatened a house, it had threatened the only stability. Isla whispered softly, "She found them." Beckham shook his head slightly. No, they found her. Had that morning, her face pale under exhaustion. She was speaking quietly to her son, trying to sound strong. Landon held the box a little tighter. This was not just about returning paper. This was about returning proof of belonging to children who might not even know how close they had come to losing. He took a slow breath and stepped forward. But as he got closer, he noticed something else. The little girl's breathing was uneven, her body trembling slightly in her mother's arms. The situation was more fragile than he imagined. When Landon realized why Avery's daughter was trembling in that crowded shelter, he understood this wasn't just about a lost box. It was about a family on the edge of breaking again. In a room full of people, loneliness can still sit in the loudest corner. The Redwood Community Evacuation Center was crowded with folding cots, plastic bins, and voices that tried to stay calm but carried exhaustion. Volunteers moved quickly between families, handing out bottled water and blankets. Children cried softly and phones buzzed with insurance calls and unanswered questions. The air felt heavy, not just from smoke that stingered in clothes, but from uncertainty. Near the far wall, Avery Collins sat on a narrow cot slightly apart from the others. She was close enough to the crowd to be seen, but distant enough. Her back was straight, her shoulders tense, as if she were holding herself upright. But beside her sat a teenage boy with dark hair falling into his eyes. He stared at the floor, hands locked together, jaw tight. This was Miles Collins, her adopted son. He looked older than his age in that moment, not because of maturity, but because of weight. The kind of weight that comes from learning too early that things do not always stay. A younger girl rested against Avery's side, clutching her stuffed anima, her small body still trembling slightly. Avery kept one arm wrapped around her daughter while glancing toward Miles every few seconds, unsure how to reach him. Landon slowed his steps as he saw it clearly now. The fire had not just burned wood and walls. It had reopened something inside that teenage boy. Before Landon could speak, Isla stepped forward gently, the wooden box held carefully in her hands. Beckham and Noel stood on either side of her like quiet support. "Avery?" Isla said. Avery looked up, confused at first. Then her eyes widened when she saw the box. For a moment, she could not breathe, her voice breaking. "You found it?" Isla nodded and extended it toward her. Avery reached out with shaking hands and pulled the box close to her chest, as if it were fragile glass. Her fingers brushed over the carved initial. She closed her eyes briefly, holding it tightly. "I thought it was gone," she said, barely audible. "I thought I lost it." She blinked quickly, trying to keep her composure in front of her children. But emotion slipped through anyway. A tear rolled down her cheek, and this time, she did not wipe it away immediately. Miles looked up at Landon and the triplets, studying them silently. His expression was guarded, almost distant. "Thank you," Avery said, her voice steadying slowly. "You have no idea what—" Landon nodded respectfully. "We saw it in the driveway. We figured it might matter. It's their adoption paper, their medical records, letters from the first day they came home." Her daughter tightened her grip on the stuffed animal. Miles's eyes flickered briefly toward the box, then away again. Landon noticed the tension immediately. It was subtle. Miles sat slightly apart, shoulders angled away from his mother, as if protecting himself. The triplets noticed too. Beckham sat down slowly on the edge of the neighboring cot without asking permission. Noel offered the younger girl a seat. Isla stayed standing, her posture open and calm. Miles finally spoke, his voice low. "It doesn't matter. It's just paper." Avery looked at him quickly. "It does matter." He shrugged slightly. "If the house burned, everything burns." The words hung heavy in the air. Landon recognized it was not anger, it was defense. The kind that builds when someone has already experienced being left before. Avery's face tightened briefly. "We're still here. That's what matters." But Landon sensed something deeper. This was not just about losing a house. It was about fear of losing. Isla spoke gently, not to challenge, but to connect. "My mom died when we were little," she said quietly. "We thought everything was—" Landon glanced at her, surprised but proud. Beckham added, "But Dad stayed." Noel looked directly at Mom. "And you're still here," she said indirectly. School wasn't easy before. He already felt like he did. The wildfire had taken away the one place that felt stable. For a boy who had once been adopted into a new family, losing a home could feel like losing proof of belonging again. Landon understood more than he expected. Rejected single parents often recognize each other without needing explanations. He saw Avery try, Yang to hold strength together while afraid of breaking in front of her children. He also saw Miles building walls he did not know how to tear down. The shelter buzzed around them, but in that small corner something quieter was. Not solutions, but understanding. As night fell, volunteers dimmed the lights slightly. Families prepared to sleep on thin cots. Uncertainty pressed in from all sides. Landon stood, unsure whether to stay longer or give them space. But just as he turned slightly toward the exit, a commotion rose near the entrance. Voices grew louder. A volunteer hurried past, whispering about a missing teen who had stepped outside alone. Landon's eyes moved instantly back to the cot. Miles was gone. That night, when Miles disappeared from the shelter, Landon realized staying might mean stepping into a responsibility he never planned to take on. Sometimes, children do not slam doors when they disappear quietly. The lights inside the evacuation shelter had dimmed, and most families were settling onto thin cots for the night. The noise had softened into low murmurs and tired breathing. Volunteers moved gently between rows, offering extra blankets. But in the corner where Avery had been sitting, her eyes suddenly widened. "Miles," she called softly. The cot beside her was empty. At first she assumed he had gone to the restroom or stepped outside for air, but something in her chest tightened. She stood quickly scanning the gym. He was not near the water station, not by the entrance, not anywhere she could see. Across the room, Isla noticed it first. "He's gone," she whispered to Beckham and Noel. They had been watching him earlier, not in a curious way, but in a protective one. They had seen the way his shoulders curved inward, the way his eyes stayed distant even when his mother spoke. They recognized that look. It was the look of someone trying to shrink. Beckham stood up immediately. "Dad." Landon turned at once, reading urgency in his son's voice before words were finished. "What is it?" Landon's eyes moved across the room, quickly assessing the space. He saw Avery now standing near the entrance, her breathing uneven as she spoke to a volunteer. "I'll check outside," he said. The parking lot was dimly lit by a few emergency lights. Smoke still hovered in the air, though thinner now. Cars lined the edges, some filled with belongings that survived the fire. The night felt heavy and uncertain. Landon spotted a figure near the far end of the lot, sitting on the curb beside a burned-out street sign, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly. Miles. Landon did not rush toward him. He walked steadily, giving the boy space to notice him first. When he reached him, he did not speak right away. He simply stood nearby. Miles did not look up. "I figured you might want some quiet," Landon said once. After a moment, Miles spoke, his voice low and tight. "I'm just making things worse." Landon sat down beside him on the curb. "Not too close. Not too far." "How?" "My sister is scared. My mom's trying to act strong. I was already a problem before this. Now I'm just extra weight." The words were simple, but they carried deep belief. Landon felt something inside him shift. He remembered sitting in his car after Marissa died, convinced he was not strong enough to, convinced they deserved someone better. He remembered wanting to disappear for a moment, not because he did not love them, but because he felt like a burden to their future. "I've seen that look before," Landon said quietly. Miles glanced at him, surprised. "I saw it in the mirror. After my wife died, I thought my kids would be better off with someone stronger." Miles frowned slightly. "But you stayed." "Yes. Not because leaving would have hurt more." Silence settled. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Miles's voice softened. "I wasn't even supposed. I got adopted. What if I just make it harder for her? Being chosen doesn't mean you're temporary. It means someone looked at you and said, 'I want you.' That doesn't disappear because a house burns." Miles stared at the ground, but his breathing slowed slightly. From the shelter entrance, 3 small figures appeared. Isla, Beckham, and Noel walked toward them without speaking. They did not interrupt. They simply sat down around Miles, forming a quiet circle. Beckham handed him a bottle of water without a word. Noel said softly, "We almost lost our house." Isla added, "Dad says houses are wood." Miles let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Inside the shelter, Avery rushed out when she saw them. Her face was pale with fear. "Miles," she called. When she reached him, she did not scold. She knelt down and pulled him into her arms tightly. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "The house doesn't matter. Nothing matters if I lose you." Miles stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed into her embrace. Landon watched quietly, feeling something settle into place. The fire had destroyed walls and furniture, but the real fear was losing. Avery looked up at Landon, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you. I didn't know how close he was to walking away." Landon nodded. "He wasn't running from you. He was running from feeling like a burden. Avery's hand tightened around her son's shoulder. "You are not a burden," she said firmly. The triplets stayed close, their presence steady and calm. They did not solve anything. They did not preach. They simply stayed. As they all walked back toward the shelter together, Landon felt something shift deeper inside him. Two families, both marked by loss, both trying to rebuild, now stood in the same fragile space. The wildfire had destroyed walls, but it had also removed the between strangers, and none of them yet understood how much their lives were about. The fire had forced two broken families into the same shelter, but neither Landon nor Avery realized yet that staying for one night might turn into something far bigger than either. Sometimes the strongest rebuilding does not begin with wood and nails. It begins with someone saying, "I'll help." But uncertainty still hung over everyone like smoke that refused. Volunteers handed out breakfast in paper trays. Families stood in lines checking phones for insurance updates. Landon watched Avery from across the gym as she filled out another form, her shoulders straight but her eyes tired. He walked over quietly. "Have you looked at rental options?" he asked gently. Avery hesitated. "I don't even know where to start. Insurance hasn't approved the claim yet. They're still reviewing the damage report." Landon nodded. He knew how long review. "I work remotely. My schedule is flexible. I can help you search listings. Call landlords. Compare rates." Her expression shifted slightly. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," he replied calmly. For a moment, she studied him carefully, as if trying to measure his. She had learned to carry things alone. Accepting help felt like admitting. But the shelter was temporary, and Miles and her daughter needed something stable soon. Just temporary guidance. Nothing more. "Temporary works," Landon answered. The next few days blended into a routine of rebuilding conversations. Landon set up his laptop on a folding table in the shelter's corner. Between answering work emails and checking server logs, he opened rental websites and made calls. His calm voice carried confidence when speaking to property managers. He did not promise anything he could not guarantee. He simply asked clear questions. Meanwhile, the community relief effort grew stronger. Local churches delivered clothing. A small business owner offered grocery gift cards. Volunteers organized donation piles by size and need. The wildfire had destroyed homes, but it had also drawn strangers closer. Miles began spending more time with the triplets. At first, he kept his distance, sitting nearby but not fully joined. Then one afternoon, Beckham asked if he could help fix a loose wheel on a borrowed bicycle. Miles surprised himself by kneeling down to adjust it carefully. Isla showed him a drawing she was working on. Noel asked about his favorite music. Slowly, without announcement, walls thinned. They did not talk directly about grief, but it existed between them quietly. Miles had been adopted after years in foster care. Stability had always felt fragile. The fire had shocked, aching it again. The triplets understood losing something permanent. They did not compare stories. They simply recognized the same ache. One evening, while the children sat outside sharing snacks from a donation box, Landon and Avery stood near the parking lot reviewing rental listings on his tablet. "There's a small duplex about 15 minutes from here. It's not perfect, but it's clean. Short-term lease." Avery sighed softly. "Even short-term requires deposit money. If insurance delays much longer," her voice trailed off. Landon understood the unspoken pressure. Single parenthood does not allow space for collapse. Bills still arrive. Children still need reassurance. "You cannot afford to break. You've handled more than most people," he said quietly. She gave a faint smile. "You too." There was no dramatic pause, no grand confession, just recognition. Two single parents carrying too much and pretending it weighed. Landon realized something during. Helping her did not feel heavy. It felt natural, as if presence was something he had been practicing for years without knowing why. He questioned himself quietly one night while answering emails. Why did stepping into her crisis feel familiar instead of burdensome? Maybe because he knew what it meant to wish someone would step into his. Days passed. Insurance emails arrived with complicated language and delayed promises. Then, late one afternoon, Avery received a call. She stepped outside to answer, her back stiff with anticipation. Landon watched from a distance, reading her body language. He saw her shoulders drop slightly, then stiffen again, then go still. When she ended the call, she did not move. He walked over carefully. "What happened?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes told a different story. "They approved partial damage cover, not full structure. All replaced. They're claiming pre-existing conditions on parts of the foundation." Landon frowned. "That's not right. They're denying the full claim," she continued quietly. The payout won't cover rebuilding. It won't even secure long-term housing. Miles stood a few feet away, listening. The younger girl clung to Avery's side. The shelter suddenly felt smaller. Insurance had not just delayed them, it had limited their future. Landon felt that old anger stir again, the one that rises when Sims protect budgets over families. But he kept his voice calm. We'll figure something out. Avery looked at him, exhaustion breaking through her. Figure what out? We don't have a permanent place. Now paperwork threatened to burn their stability, and as night settled over the shelter again, reality felt heavier than before. With insurance denying Avery's full fire claim, she and Miles were left without a permanent home, and Landon knew the next choice made could change all of their lives. Sometimes the hardest choice is not leaving, it is choosing to stay when leaving. The insurance denial changed the air between them. What had felt uncertain now felt urgent. The shelter could not hold families forever, and short-term rentals were filling fast. One evening as the children played quietly near the gym doors, Avery sat across from Landon with a folded piece of paper in her hand. My aunt lives in Oregon. We're not close, but she offered a spare room. It would mean starting over again. New school for Miles. New doctors. New everything. Starting over can sound hopeful, but it can also feel like another form of loss. Miles sat a few feet away, pretending to scroll through his phone. But he was listening. I don't want to move. Voice tight. I'm tired of packing. Avery looked at him with sadness. We don't have a house here anymore. I don't care about the house, Miles replied quietly. I care about not losing everything again. The words hung heavy. Landon felt something stir in his chest. He understood that exhaustion. Every time life broke, rebuilding demanded more energy than he felt he had. After his wife died, people told him to consider moving closer to family. He almost did. But he chose to stay because his children needed one thing to remain constant. The triplets did not argue or interrupt. They simply moved closer to Miles. Beckham handed him a snack without a word. Isla showed him a picture she had drawn of all 6 of them standing under a bright blue sky. Noelle nudged him gently with her shoulder. You're already part of our bike group, Beckham said quietly. Miles tried not to smile, but he failed. Landon watched that moment carefully. The bond forming between the children was not loud or dramatic. It was steady. That night, while the younger kids slept, Landon stood outside the shelter with Avery. The sky was finally clear, stars faint but visible. I have a spare room, he said. It's small, but it's quiet. You and the kids could stay temporarily. No pressure. Just until things settle. Avery froze slightly. That's too much. It's a room, not a lifetime. She looked at him for a long moment. Accepting help meant trusting again. It meant believing someone would not walk away when things became complicated. I don't want to depend on someone, she admitted. I don't want to lose people again, Landon said, surprising himself with his arm. They stood there in silence, 2 adults shaped by loss, both afraid of attachment for different reasons. Inside the shelter, the triplets had already made space on their shared mattress for Miles to sit closer. They were not asking permission from, they were responding to instinct. Community support had begun growing slowly. A local contractor offered discounted labor for damaged homes. A church group started a small rebuilding. Neighbors who once barely spoke now shared phone numbers. Crisis had stripped away pride and reply. Avery watched her son laugh softly at something Beckham said. It had been weeks since she had heard that sound. Stability was not a house. And somehow, near Landon and his children, rhythm was returning. I don't want him to feel temporary, she whispered. Then don't treat him like Landon replied. The decision did not come with applause or certainty. It came quietly, in the middle of exhaustion. The next afternoon, Avery loaded a small suitcase into Landon's car, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she chose not to leave. The spare room in Landon's house was set. Clean sheet, a small desk, a window overlooking a half-burned fence that would eventually be. It was not grand, but it was steady. Miles placed his backpack down slowly, as if testing whether. We're not replacing anything, Landon said calmly. We're just sharing space. The triplets immediately pulled Miles into their routine. Bike rides in the evening, homework at the kitchen table, quiet laughter over cereal bowl. It felt less like charity and more like extension. Avery stood in the doorway that night, watching her son fall asleep without tension in his jaw for the first time in days. Chosen family is not built in comfort. It is built when someone stays awake longer than usual. He knew attachment meant risk, but he also knew absence meant regret. Just as the house began to feel warmer, just as stability started forming, a neigh. Was alert buzzed across multiple phones in the neighborhood. Wildfire investigators had released preliminary findings. The fire that destroyed their street had not been purely natural, and what caused it was anyone expected. Just as two families chose to stay under one roof, the investigation revealed something shocking about how the fire started near their, and it threatened to shake everything. The fire burned down their houses, but it could not burn down the choice to stay. The news report that shook the neighborhood traveled fast, but within days, the full investigation brought clarity. Officials confirmed that the wildfire had started due to a damaged power line during extreme winds. There was no wrongdoing tied to any homeowner, no hidden blame, no secret mistake from any. When Avery read the final report, her shoulders lowered for the first time in weeks. The weight of silent suspicion. Soon after, another call came, this time from the insurance company. The investigation findings forced them to review multiple claims again. Structural damage that had previously been labeled as partial was now reassessed under disaster liability protection. Avery's full claim was approved. She sat at Landon's kitchen table when she heard the words, "We are issuing the corrected payout within 10 business days." For a moment she could not respond. Landon watched her carefully. Recognize. It was not disbelief. It was relief trying to enter a body that had been braced for bad news too long. "It's approved," she said softly after ending the call. All of it. The triplets cheered without fully understanding numbers or policies. They understood. They understood that Avery's eyes were no longer clouded with fear. Miles stood quietly, absorbing the shift. Stability was no longer an idea. It was possible again. The payout meant Avery she could repair what was lost. She could secure long-term housing without leaving town. The offer from her aunt in Oregon remained open, but this time, she did not feel pulled by desperation. That evening, she sat on the back steps with Landon while the kids played in the yard. "I thought I would have to leave. I was already preparing myself to start over somewhere else." "And now?" Landon asked gently. "Now I don't want to," she said. It was not just about the money. It was about what had formed in the middle of crisis. It was about her son sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. It was about laughter returning to spaces that once felt broken. Miles began therapy through a community relief program funded after the fire. At first, he resisted, but slowly he opened up about his fear of being temporary, about how losing the house had felt like losing that he belonged somewhere. The therapist helped him name those instead of running from them. At home, the triplets included him in everything without making it a performance. Homework at the kitchen table, bike rides down the repaired sidewalk, late-night serial conversations about music. They did not treat him like a guest. They treated him like someone expected to stay. Avery watched that transformation carefully. She saw her son laugh again, without guarding his expression. She saw him argue playfully with Beckham over video games. She saw him ask Landon for advice about a coding project for school. The house Landon once considered temporary had expanded in ways he never planned. Not physically, but emotionally. He realized something quietly one night while fixing the backyard fence that the fire had damaged. For years, rebuilding had felt like a lonely task. After his wife died, every repair felt symbolic. Fix the roof, fix the schedule, fix the grief, always alone. Now, when he worked outside, Miles handed him tools. The triplets offered suggestions. Avery stood nearby with a glass of water and quiet encouragement. Rebuilding no longer felt solitary. Avery made her decision. She signed a contract to rebuild her house on the same lot. She chose not to leave town, not because she was afraid of change, but because she had found something steady in the middle of destruction. Here was no dramatic romance. No sudden declarations. What grew between her and Landon was quieter than that. It was partnership, shared grocery lists, shared school pickups, shared understanding of single-parent exhaustion. They did not promise forever. They practiced presence. The children, without realizing it, had triggered everything. If Isla had not noticed the box in the driveway, if Beckham had not insisted it mattered, if Noelle had not said she looked, none of this would. Sometimes children see what adults overlook. Months later, as Avery's rebuilt home took shape across the street, the neighborhood felt alive again. Fresh paint replaced soot. New fences stood where burned wood once fell. The smell of smoke had finally faded. Landon stood on his porch one evening, watching Avery's new front door being installed. Miles helped carry supplies inside. The triplets ran across the yard laughing. He realized he no longer feared rebuilding the way. Avery no longer feared surviving alone. Isolation had turned into belonging, not through grand gestures, but through staying when it would have. The fire had taken furniture, walls, and memories tied to wood, but it had left behind something stronger. Sometimes the fire takes everything you own, but it leaves behind the one thing you didn't know. People who choose to stay when the smoke clears. If this story meant something to you, don't just let it fade like smoke. Stay connected to stories that remind us that even in loss, we can choose presence, courage, and kindness. Share this with someone who needs hope after a hard season, and subscribe if you believe real strength is found. And now I want to ask you something honestly. If life burned down the place you felt safest, would you rebuild alone, or would you allow Amion to stand beside you? Tell me in the comments.